Welcome back. Another episode of ShiftED podcast, coming to you from Montreal, Canada. And I'm reaching down to Michigan, I believe. Kevin Dykema is coming in to share some math mindset stuff with us. And it's Michigan, right, Kevin? That you're
It is absolutely yep. Southwest corner of Michigan.
amazing. And are you still the president of the NCTM?
Yeah, so my term actually, it was a 2-year term, ended like the 1st of October. So now I'm technically the past president for a
Okay.
year. So I get the honor of supporting the current president and helping her succeed.
Amazing, amazing. Great stuff too coming out of. I mean, there's so many resources out there for math teachers, um, and expertise as well. I mean, it seems to be one of our subjects that gets a lot of attention, a lot of misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and struggle as well. And that's kind of what we'll focus on here today is that productive struggle. But before we start, Kevin, were you always into math? Was that your jive at a young age as you grew up?
It was. I always felt successful in math. And I mean, looking back now, I can argue I didn't understand a lot of what I did, but I always did very, very well
Right.
in mathematics and memorized things. I was a good rule memorizer. I could follow the procedures. It wasn't until I started teaching that I actually had to get to the understanding stage. And I think I learned more my first few years of teaching middle school math than I did actually as a K-12 or a college major in mathematics when you actually have to start to see the why behind things and to start to
Right.
see connections between different things. And to this day, I mean, I think every time I work with a group of teachers, work with a group of students, I learn new things or I see things differently. Because when we allow our learners to share their thinking, good things start happening, and my students often see things differently than I see
Right.
the different content areas.
Amazing. Amazing. And like we tend to teach the way we were taught, right?
Yes.
And math is I remember my math classes in particular, obviously, and how kind of removed the student was from the whole learning process. And the teachers I see, pre-service teachers and first year teachers coming into the system that tend to, go to what they know, which is how they were taught. Um, is there a disconnect you find between how we're getting teachers ready to teach math? Because in elementary school, for example, I mean, it's a lot of non-math experts, right? You're a general in elementary school here in Quebec anyway. Um, and then as you go into high school, you're expected to be, more of an expert. But like, is there a disconnect between how we prepare our math teachers to the reality of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's necessarily a disconnect. I mean, I think a lot of our colleges of education are doing a great job of saying this is what it could look like, but
Right.
then they get into a school system where it doesn't look like what they're doing. That in the education world, we're slow to change,
Mm,
especially in the math world. And when I think about the secondary folks, for many of us, we were great rule memorizers, and
right.
school worked for us. Having the
Mm,
teacher just say, here is the steps, here's step one, here's step two, here's step three, memorize it and you'll be good. That worked for us. And we became
right.
math teachers. And because it worked for us, we think it should work for everybody. And I'm
Mm,
overgeneralizing here, but for Hopkins, we
sure.
think it should work for everybody. And the reality is, it does not work for everybody. Having
Mm,
math be taught very, very procedurally has not worked for decades and decades and decades for all. It works for
mm,
some, and if we're truly interested in meeting the needs of all of our learners, we need to look at doing things differently. And change
right.
is hard. So I think they're in many colleges of education, they're being taught what they should be doing, but then they get into the school setting, and the school setting looks the same as it did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, oftentimes in math. That doesn't
Right.
mean we haven't made some improvements in math, but there's a lot of room to grow. And I love how you noted, I mean, I don't love how you noted, but I appreciate how you noted in math, it hasn't been very student centered in the
Mm,
past. It's been very
mm,
much teacher driven. And when
right.
we think about productive struggle, we need to get our students engaged in that learning that's required in order to make sense of the mathematics.
Absolutely. And Kevin, what is mathematics? Like, I saw one of your presentations where you led with that question, like, what is it? Like, could you expand on like what that term is?
Yeah. And I think that's a fundamental question. And
Mm,
I think the way that you answer that question of what is mathematics affects how you think that math should be taught, how math should be learned, or even why we have to learn math. I think for so many of our students, I'll go from the student perspective first. I think many of our students see math as I just need to learn this formula, I need to learn this
mm,
equation, I need to follow this procedure, and poof, I'll get a correct answer. Getting correct answers is very, very important. But I think when you talk with a lot of mathematicians, when you talk with a lot of mathematics educators, words that come to their mind instantly when we talk about what is mathematics, it's problem solving, critical thinking, reasoning and sense making, explaining the real world around them. So there's this
mm,
disconnect between what we think mathematics should be and what many of our students see mathematics as. And that's on us as a mathematics education community to change that and to really help our students begin to see that math is understandable. It's not all these random sets of procedures, and we know they're not random sets of procedures, but for many
right,
students, they're viewing them as just random sets of procedures that they have to follow. We need to teach math in such a way that it makes it coherent for our students
yeah,
and so that it builds from grade to grade to grade. And they see, oh, what I'm learning in grade seven is really taking some of that work that I did in grade three and just generalizing a little bit more. And then, oh, when I go to grade 10, I'm going to take that same learning and just extend it a little bit more. And we don't have as much of that as we could if we're truly interested in meeting the needs of all of our kids.
mm, totally, totally, yeah, super interesting. And I mean, your book, Productive Math Struggle, you mentioned worthy of struggle, right? That students have to go through this. And as teachers, I mean, we're very compassionate and empathetic
Yes.
towards our students. We sometimes it makes us uncomfortable when we see them struggling. How do we change that mindset that we need to let them struggle, and that they're worthy of the struggle? I love that term.
Yeah. And I think we know we've got to make sure that we're defining struggle carefully.
Right.
I'm certainly not advocating for, when I walk into class and all the kids are in tears or all the kids have put their heads down, I'm not like, oh, this class is rocking it. It's that productive struggle. It's got to lead somewhere. And I
Mm,
think about, learning in general. If I go out of the math classroom for a little bit, when you think about, learning a new instrument, there's a lot of struggle involved with that, but yet we value that struggle and we recognize it's okay that you don't have it perfect right off the bat. It's okay that you're exploring, that you're messing around, trying to figure things out, sort of grappling with how to hold the instrument, how to blow with a horn, whatever the case may
right.
be. But then in math, it comes sort of to a grinding halt. And too
Mm,
often we just teach math as this procedure after procedure after procedure. And our students don't see math then as something that they need to be studying because realistically they say, I have a calculator. I'm in my at all times with my cell phone. So I think when we think about, mathematics needs to be worthy of a struggle and it's that all students should be doing that. We need to help our students recognize that math is understandable.
mm,
There's a reason for that. It makes sense. And let's teach math as sense making. Let's get our students actively engaged, wrestling, struggling, grappling, whatever word you want to use at that point in time, to have them begin to make some of that sense. I often
mm,
think, in a typical traditional classroom, and it's for decades and decades and decades, the teacher is the one that's doing all of the intellectual work. Maybe not all, doing the vast majority of the intellectual work in a math classroom.
mm,
And the kids are sort of along for a free ride. We need to get
mm,
our kids doing that deep thinking that's required to be able to make sense. And
mm.
the teachers are providing that support along the way and helping to ensure that every student is being successful.
Right. I love your examples too, that it is a skill that you develop. I mean, similar to creativity example, right? Like some teachers, or some people I should say, oh, I'm not creative, right? But again, it's this muscle that you work on, right? And
Yes.
grow and develop. Um, Oftentimes though, I've noticed that the relevancy, right? So you mentioned like learning an instrument. I see the value because I'm motivated in it's relevant to me, right? I'm interested in it.
Yep.
How do you turn that in a math class to make it relevant? Um, and I remember you had mentioned that math is all around us. And again, that disconnect between students seeing it relevant in their world, when they walk outside of the school, that they start to notice these patterns or things that are similar. Or can you expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I think some of it's, it comes back to the how are we thinking about math and what are we looking at with math? And if we're being honest, much of the math that we do in the K-12 setting is not the math that they see in the world around them. I pick on high schools sometimes that, you know, you factor trinomials in high school, but you're not factoring trinomials outside of the walls of your school for most adults. I mean, there may be some that are doing that for their career. So we have to quit trying to find every single topic that we may teach in math and say, oh, it definitely applies to the real world in this way.
Hmm.
But we need to help our students recognize that math was developed for a reason.
Hmm.
Somebody at some point in time, and math is still being developed. I don't want students to walk away thinking, oh, it's just all this past stuff that we're just redoing.
Right.
But then somebody had a real life problem that they needed to solve. And because they needed to be able to have some way to describe a curve, different mathematics was generated because it needed a different way to describe the way a leaf may grow on a tree. And we get new math that is created at that point in time. So we need
Hmm.
to help our students we need to do a better job of helping our students see the connections between developing math and that math has been used to solve real world problems. We can look at some real world situations and use some mathematics, use some data, use some statistics to help analyze some of those
Right.
different situations that are going on in the world around them and helping them just begin to see there's a lot of math in there. People are
Hmm.
using some of that logical thinking, that critical thinking. They're using data to make decisions. And when we look at, especially like the last 10 years, the amount of data that's being collected and the amount of data that's being used to make decisions has rapidly increased. And we owe it to our students to have them develop a good understanding of that world around them and how we can maybe describe it mathematically.
Right. Right. Totally cool. And I mean, I love these ideas too, that when we are teaching math and that students are going through that process of figuring it out, that they bring certain luggage with them, the kids. And you talk about it in your book, this kind of math trauma of sorts, where they don't feel like they belong
Yes.
in math, like they just, there's this wall and it's really hard to break down. But I love in your book, you talk about the belongingness in that struggle. Can you expand on that a bit? Because I find it so fascinating that this sense that if I don't feel like I have a purpose within this class that's talking math, that I, you know, I'm excluded from it, which again perpetuates this math trauma that our young kids go through.
Very much so. And sometimes I like to frame it around this idea of a mathematical identity.
Hmm.
And I think in the United States and Canada, and I can't speak for all of Canada and or all of the United States, but as I work with educators primarily in the United States and some in Canada,
Hmm.
I hear that frequently that, in society, it's very cool to say, I'm not good at math.
Right. Yep.
But you don't hear that same adult say, I'm not good at reading. They may say they don't enjoy reading. So as a society, we've sort of made it cool to say, I'm not good at math.
Hmm.
So it's okay to feel like you don't belong in there because nobody does good at math unless, when you think of who is a math person, for many of us, we grew up in a time, where it was those that wore pocket protectors were those that did math or those that had suspenders or was sort of the geeky type of stuff. So we have to break down some of those walls and we need to help our students recognize that we're all capable of
Hmm.
learning math. And we need to share stories of people who are doing math. When you ask a typical K-12 student, describe a mathematician, it's an old person,
Hmm.
often somebody who's dead, somebody who's Caucasian, most of the time male, frizzy hair.
Hmm.
As a math education community, we need to be sharing stories of other mathematicians. We need to be finding mathematicians who are still developing math. We need to find those mathematicians who are young, so that students see themselves as capable of learning math. They're recognizing, oh, it's not just Pythagoras, it's not just Euclid, it's not just Archimedes, it's not just Gauss, it's not just those that we think of from centuries and centuries ago as mathematicians. People are still doing mathematics, and it's not just dead white males that did mathematics, that they see themselves. And when they see themselves reflected in people who are doing math currently, they're going to begin to get a sense of belonging.
Mm,
And I also think that when we focus on really getting to by math by understanding rather than just math by memorizing, students start to feel like they belong in there then because they recognize, oh, I am capable of
mm.
understanding this. Math is an understandable subject. And there's so much work that we can do to help increase mathematical opportunities for all of our students.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. Could you elaborate a bit? You're in the book. It talks about the 6 point action plan for
Yeah.
fostering this kind of perseverance, and I'd even extend that in developing that community, that math community within your class, where everyone feels that they can contribute to the thinking that's going on. Can you can you talk a bit about those 6 points and
Yeah, very
how
much
that
so.
leads to? Yeah.
Yeah. So when John, Susie, and I wrote the book, we said, we need to come up with sort of an action plan for teachers because it's not just going to happen instantly that all of a sudden the kids are going to be like, oh, I'm so excited to have to think deeply about math and to do that. It's not like a light switch that you can go and flick on. So what are some of those intentional steps that we can do? So the first thing we said, we need to work on valuing this notion of really wrestling, grappling, making sense of the mathematics both from the educator perspective as well as helping our students see there's value in not just being told what to do and just memorizing. There's value in having to work hard at developing a good sense of understanding. So that
Mm,
first action step is value. That second action step is to foster a positive mathematical identity. We talked about that with the belonging. If they don't feel like they belong in the world of mathematics, they're not gonna feel capable of doing that. So we need to foster that positive mathematical identity and help all students recognize they are capable of learning mathematics. That third action, then we need to build a classroom community that's supportive of really wrestling. And what does it look like? What are the norms? What does it look like when you sort of get stuck? How might we get unstuck, for lack of
mm,
a better word? What are some things that we can
right.
do at that point in time? That fourth action then is to plan our lessons for it. What
Mm,
can we do? Where can we really provoke that deep thinking? What are some strategic changes and some questions that we may have asked in the past? How can we change that a problem we may have done to make it a little bit deeper thinking at that point in time? And then as part of that planning, then it's also anticipating what are the students going to do? How are they going to do it correctly? What are some of those correct strategies they may do? As well as what are some of those misconceptions or partial conceptions that they may bring? And then how am I
mm,
going to respond to that? What am I going to ask so that it's not just me rescuing their thinking or rescuing their answers? I'm rescuing their thinking and really helping them go from there. That fifth
mm,
step then is to support the productive struggle. All right, what am I going to do when the kid hits that point where they say they're stuck? And I think so much of that's because of the planning. If I've planned
mm,
well, I'm going to be able to support better at that point in time. And when we support, we have a rich history in mathematics of when a teacher helps a kid, we grab their writing utensil and we do all the writing for them. That's not what we're talking about here with supporting the struggle. It's really getting to that student's thinking, helping them explain what are they currently thinking, and then providing some prompts to help them make sense. And
mm,
then that final action, that final step is to reflect back on that productive struggle.
right.
We need our students to see, hey, 3 days ago, I might have thought this was the most impossible thing in the world. But because I didn't give up, because I kept trying to make sense of it, now I've made sense of it. And I'm like, oh, it's not so bad.
Mm,
And when we do a little bit of that reflecting back on it, then we can celebrate it with the students, which then just helps to build that positive mathematical identity. So we look at those six actions: the valuing, the fostering, the building, the planning, the supporting, and the reflecting as a
mm.
way to really engage all of our students in this notion of making math understandable and doing math by understanding rather than math by memorizing.
Yeah, totally. And like, walk us through a period. Like, how would you see a successful thinking mathematically classroom? Like, how would it start, and then what would the teacher get the students doing? Could you kind of walk us through what that would look and feel like?
Yeah. And depending on the content, the concept you're
Sure.
learning, it's going to look a little bit different. And, what it looks like in a first grade class is going to look different than in a grade 11 class or a grade 8 class. But overall, the kids are going to be working on a good, rich task, a good, rich problem. something
Mm,
that's gonna spark some thinking at that point in time. And I often like to, start out with that problem. That so often, for many of us, we did all some people call them the naked number problems, where there's no context. And then question number 38 was a real life application. And sometimes, let's be honest, the real life applications that we use aren't real life.
yeah.
But starting out with a
Mm,
contextual problem, helping them understand why we even care about this, get the students actively engaged, get them sharing their thinking in small groups. And then as we're trying to wrap it up, that's maybe when we get a little bit more of that procedural fluency, when we get some more of that
mm,
procedural stuff.
yeah,
I think historically, one of the flips that I like to think about historically in math, we've told our kids, here's the procedure to follow, here's the steps you need to do, now you think.
right.
When I'm thinking about productive struggle, when I'm thinking about what a good math classroom should look like, could look like, let's get our kids thinking right off the bat. We can provide more of that step by step at the end as a way to wrap up, as a way to formalize their thinking, as a way to make sure that yes, we are good to go on from there. But
Mm,
a good classroom, the kids are doing the work. The kids are
right.
thinking. The kids are not just sitting there listening to the teacher do all of the thinking, all of the talking, all class long. And it's hard.
Mm,
It's hard to shift that because we talked about it earlier. For so many of us as educators, we grew up in a time where the teacher did all the work in the math classroom,
right.
and we just had to sort of follow along and hope that we could mimic the teacher's steps. We need
Mm,
to be changing that. We need to be getting our students to do that rich, deep thinking. Help the students see the connections between different things. Help the students
right.
make sense of the mathematics, and then we can provide some of that structure towards the end of a typical
Mm,
math class then.
yeah, for sure. I love that idea too. It's a small tweak, but just throwing the question at the start or the
Yeah,
problem at the start and allowing the students to kind of like struggle with it a bit. And
very
then
much
if there's
so.
any misunderstandings, you can clean those up at the end.
Yes.
Um, yeah,
And we have to recognize not all kids are going to do the problem the same
right,
way, and that's
right.
okay. And if I'm being honest, sometimes my students see problems a whole lot neater than I do. That my brain, because I'm been just so focused on math, 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 I jump to straight all the time to let's write an equation for it. Most students do not jump straight to let's write an equation for it. Most students wrestle through and actually think with that.
Mm,
One of the things like I often like to do when I'm leading some professional development, either with sharing a math night for parents, working with teachers, working with administrators, working with students, I may say, how would you do 245 plus 98? And for most people, they say, oh, if I'm going to do 245 plus 98, I'm going to think of it as 245 plus 100 and subtract 2, or some other strategy that they may have.
right.
There's lots of different strategies. Like, all right, this is what we need to be making our math classes like. We
Mm,
need our kids to be doing that thinking. We shouldn't just say, oh, back in 19 whatever, here is the one and only one way that we could do the
right.
245 plus 98. Let's get our kids thinking, sharing their reasoning. And that means we need to have that comfort of recognizing it's okay if they don't do it the exact same way that I may have done. And it's okay if they have a way that I'm like, oh, I'm not positive that it works. For us to say, all right, hey, let's try it with a different set of numbers and to see if it works. And it's a shift for the kids and it's a shift for the teachers, but it's
Mm,
so powerful for our students. And it helps our students to see that math is capable of being understood. And math is useful. It's not just the subject that people did decades, centuries ago, and that we're just relearning everything that they did however many years ago, and there's really no value at it. We have to have our students see the uses of that, see when they would use the mathematics in a variety of different settings.
for sure. It's interesting that you're saying that too, because I'm thinking about when I'm working with kids in coding, either we're doing a Scratch project or we're like programming in Arduino something, like that thought process is very similar to what you were mentioning there. And I wanted to ask you that crossroads, because coding definitely seems to be something that is becoming more and more relevant. It's going to affect way more people's lives. Where does coding and math meet?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of those things that I think about, and I talk with other people, and I don't think as a collective education community we've come to any resolution yet about how
Mm.
to intersect those. That everybody's saying, yeah, there's a lot of overlap in there,
Right.
but to figure out how do we fully integrate that into there. And we have a finite set of minutes that we have our students in school. So anytime we try to add something in,
Right.
theoretically something needs to go out, and we need to figure out what is it that needs to go out. I often like to, instead of thinking, what are we eliminating? What are we de-emphasizing? What are we going to
Mm.
emphasize? What are we
Right.
going to de-emphasize a little bit? And sometimes when we start thinking about, oh, I can de-emphasize this, after a period of time, we're like, all right, why am I even doing this anymore? But sometimes it
Mm.
feels harsh just to say, oh, I've loved doing X for however many years. I can no longer do it. Let's just sort of gradually do a little bit of phasing out. And some of it's, we've got to recognize, what are the skill sets that our students are going to need to have in order to be productive citizens in the world. And coding is definitely one of those that they need to be able to have a better understanding of what it is. And the more and more technology driven that we become, we need students who have an appreciation and have some skill set in that world of coding.
Right. Right. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation, Kevin. I really appreciate you carving a bit of time to share your thoughts with us. And I'm really excited that you're going to be supporting our math consultants and teachers. And I think that these kinds of conversations are super rich and just kind of reflecting on our practice a bit. And realizing that it's not like we have to change everything. We
Yeah.
can make small adjustments that allow more thinking into the classroom and giving it a bit more back to the student, which I really appreciate those thoughts. And your book is just really just a great plethora of ideas and starters. I wanted to talk a little bit about rich tasks, but I
Yeah.
mean, your book touches on those a lot. But maybe my final question to you as we close here is,
Mhm.
what makes a good rich task, in your opinion?
Yeah. I think a good rich task, it's something that has an interesting context. And I will acknowledge an interesting context for student one is not an interesting context for student two. So you're not going to have a task that every single kid's going to be like, oh, I love the context of this, but it has to be in some sort of a relative interesting context. It has to have a variety of different strategies that students may use for it. Some may make a table of values, some may jump to an equation, some may make a graph, some may reason through it. There has to be, some way for all the students to be able to at least get started on the problem. They may not all have the ability initially to find a solution in a relatively quick amount of time, but a way that they all can get started at that point in time. It has to
Mm,
be aligned to the content. We can't
right.
just pull out these things and say, "Oh, this is kind of a fun thing to do." It has to actually promote that good, solid thinking that's necessary in order for them to learn that content. But it's really, the multiple strategies, something that's contextual based, so that they see that math is useful. Math is relevant to my life as a whatever grade student I am at that point in time.
Amazing. Well, these have been some math nuggets for sure. Again, well, I mean, just that rich task. I mean, it's starting in the reflective process,
Yep.
which is amazing. So, amazing kind of thoughts that you've thrown out. And again, thanks so much. And I wish you all the best. Have a great holiday season with your loved ones. And again, looking forward to seeing your influence in our system throughout this year.
Well, thanks for having me on to talk math education.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin.